When 16-year-old Sarah Thompson raised her hand in AP English class, she never imagined it would spark a revolution. But in the halls of Riverside High, where privilege wore a polite smile and discrimination hid behind tradition, one moment of defiance was about to change everything. Armed with nothing but truth and her mother's unwavering spirit, Sarah was about to learn that some lessons aren't found in any textbook. Sarah Thompson sat in the last row of her advanced placement English class at Riverside High, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of her notebook. At 16, she was one of only 3 black students in the class, and the only one in the last row, not by choice, but by Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's strategic seating arrangement implemented at the start of the semester. Mrs. Blackwood, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair always pulled into a severe bun, had been teaching at Riverside for over 2 decades. She carried herself with an air of aristocratic superiority that seemed to seep into every word she spoke, every glance she cast across the classroom. Today, we'll be discussing the literary devices in Toni Morrison's Beloved, Mrs. Blackwood announced, her voice carrying a hint of disdain as she held up the book as if it were something distasteful. Though I must say I had reservations about including this in our curriculum. Some literature is perhaps too ethnic for a classical education. Sarah's hand tightened around her pen, her knuckles whitening. She'd read Beloved 3 times already, first on her own at 13, then again with her mother, Dr. Regina Thompson, who held a Ph.D. in African American literature from Columbia University. The 3rd time had been just last week, in preparation for this unit. The class continued with Mrs. Blackwood's commentary becoming increasingly problematic. She spoke about the characters as if they were simple caricatures, missing entirely the depth of generational trauma and the complexity of the mother-daughter relationship that formed the novel's core. Sarah raised her hand, unable to contain herself any longer. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes swept past her as if she were invisible. Another student, Emma Chen, noticed and frowned, raising her own hand to point out that Sarah had been waiting to speak. "Yes, Miss Chen?" Mrs. Blackwood acknowledged Emma while continuing to ignore Sarah. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah had her hand up first," Emma said firmly. The teacher's lips thinned into a tight line. "Very well. Miss Thompson, do you have something to contribute?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Yes, ma'am. I believe your interpretation of Seth's character might be missing some crucial context. The novel isn't just about—" "Miss Thompson," Mrs. Blackwood cut her off, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I doubt you have the academic foundation to critique my analysis. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in regular English." The classroom fell silent. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah felt heat rising to her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwood, I've studied this novel extensively. My mother is actually a professor of African American literature." "Ah, yes," Mrs. Blackwood's smile turned cruel. "Your mother, the one who insists on being called doctor. You know, in my day, we understood our place in society without trying to rise above it with fancy titles." The bell rang, but nobody moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah slowly gathered her books, her movements deliberate and controlled, just as her mother had taught her. "My mother earned her doctorate from Columbia University, Mrs. Blackwood, and yes, she insists on her title because she worked twice as hard to earn it." "Twice as hard?" Mrs. Blackwood scoffed. "Or perhaps standards were lowered to accommodate certain demographics." By now, several students had pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Sarah stood, her full height matching Mrs. Blackwood's. "I'll be sure to ask the department head about those standards during our meeting tomorrow. My mother serves on the educational board, you see." Mrs. Blackwood's face paled slightly, but she doubled down. "Are you threatening me, Miss Thompson?" "Not at all," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm simply following the proper channels to address discriminatory behavior in the classroom. As you've taught us, documentation is important, which is why I've been recording every class session since the semester began." The teacher's face went from pale to red. "That's illegal. You can't—" "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "in this state, recording in a public school classroom is perfectly legal, especially when documenting potential civil rights violations." Dr. Regina Thompson stood in the doorway, her presence commanding immediate attention. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her natural hair styled in elegant twists, and her expression was both serene and formidable. Several students recognized her from her recent appearances on national news programs discussing educational reform. I received some concerning texts from several parents, Dr. Thompson continued, stepping into the classroom. It seems their children have been sharing some disturbing stories about this class. I thought it best to come see for myself. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Dr. Thompson turned to the students still present. Would you mind giving us the room? Except you, Sarah. Please stay. The students filed out, many of them casting supportive glances at Sarah. Emma gave her a quick squeeze on the arm as she passed. As the last student left, Dr. Thompson closed the classroom door, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor as she approached Mrs. Blackwood's desk. Now then, Dr. Thompson said, placing her briefcase on a nearby student desk, let's discuss your interpretation of beloved, shall we? And while we're at it, we can talk about the multiple complaints I've received about your teaching methods over the past 3 years. Mrs. Blackwood found her voice. Any complaints against me have been thoroughly dismissed by the administration. Yes, Dr. Thompson smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm aware. That's precisely why I've spent the last 6 months gathering evidence and building a case. You see, Mrs. Blackwood, I believe in teaching moments, and you've provided an excellent opportunity to demonstrate how systemic racism can be dismantled, methodically, legally, and completely. She opened her briefcase and began laying out documents. Shall we begin with the statistical analysis of your grading patterns over the past 5 years? Or would you prefer to start with the collected testimonies from former students? Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Her mother had taught her from an early age that the best response to racism wasn't just anger, it was strategic action backed by irrefutable evidence. But she also knew this was just the beginning of what promised to be a long and complicated process. Outside the classroom, students huddled near the door, their phones still recording. News would spread quickly through the school's hallways, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. The question wasn't just about one teacher's behavior or one student's response. It was about the deeper changes that needed to happen within the educational system itself. And Dr. Regina Thompson had been preparing for this moment for years. The next morning, Riverside High was buzzing with tension. Sarah walked through the hallways, aware of the whispers and glances following her path. Her phone had been flooded with messages of support from classmates, but also with a few hostile comments from students who thought she was causing trouble. During first period, Principal Harrison's voice crackled over the intercom. Attention students and faculty. There will be an emergency staff meeting during lunch period. All morning classes will proceed as scheduled. Sarah had American History first period, and she could feel the eyes of her classmates as she took her seat. Her teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, gave her a subtle nod of encouragement before beginning his lecture on the civil rights movement, a topic that suddenly felt more relevant than ever. During the break between classes, Emma Chen caught up with Sarah at her locker. "Your mom is my new hero," she said, leaning against the adjacent locker. "Did you see the local news this morning? Someone leaked the video." Sarah hadn't watched the news. She'd been too busy helping her mother prepare documentation. "How bad is it?" "It's everywhere," Emma replied, pulling out her phone to show Sarah. "But here's the thing. Mrs. Blackwood's daughter is trying to defend her on social media. She's a junior at State University, and she's claiming your mom is playing the race card to advance her career." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but her mother's words echoed in her mind. They always lash out when they're scared of losing power. Document everything, stay focused, and let them reveal themselves. By third period, Sarah learned that Mrs. Blackwood had called in sick. Her AP English class was being covered by Ms. Martinez, a young teacher from the Spanish department, who seemed both nervous and determined to make the class worthwhile. "I know we're all aware of yesterday's events," Ms. Martinez began, "but education doesn't stop for controversy. Today we're going to continue our discussion of beloved, and I want to hear your thoughts on the themes of trauma and healing in the novel." The discussion that followed was more open and honest than any they'd had all semester. Students who had previously remained silent began sharing their perspectives. Tyler Watson, a white student who usually sat quietly in the middle row, raised his hand. "You know, I never really got why this book was such a big deal before," he admitted. "But after yesterday, I went home and actually read the first few chapters properly. It's not just about slavery. It's about how people deal with pain and how the past affects everything, even now. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, a different kind of conversation was taking place. History teacher Mr. Rodriguez sat with a group of younger faculty members, their voices low but intense. "It's not just Blackwood," he was saying. "She's a symptom, not the cause. How many times have we seen qualified students of color steered away from AP classes? How many times have we heard certain colleagues make concerned comments about maintaining academic standards?" "But what can we do?" asked Ms. Parker from the math department. "The administration always circles the wagons when these issues come up." "Maybe that's exactly why Dr. Thompson is doing this so publicly," Mr. Rodriguez replied. "She's not just going after one teacher, she's exposing a whole system." In the administrative offices, Principal Harrison was on his third conference call of the morning. The district superintendent, the school board, and the teachers' union were all demanding answers. On his desk lay a thick folder, Dr. Thompson's preliminary report on systemic discrimination at Riverside High. It wasn't just about Mrs. Blackwood anymore. The document detailed 5 years of incidents, patterns and disciplinary actions, and statistical analyses of academic tracking that revealed disturbing trends. During lunch period, Sarah sat with Emma and a few other students in the courtyard, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. A shadow fell across their table, and they looked up to see Jason Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood's nephew, and a senior at Riverside. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" he said, his voice tight with anger. "My aunt's being destroyed on social media. She's getting death threats. Is that what you wanted?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut in. "Back off, Jason." It was Marcus Johnson, captain of the debate team. "Your aunt did this to herself. We've all seen how she treats students of color. The only difference is now there's proof." Jason's face reddened. "She's given 30 years of her life to this school. She doesn't deserve." "30 years of what?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. 30 years of making students feel less than? 30 years of subtle dismissals and not-so-subtle insults? Your aunt had 30 years to do better, to learn, to grow. Instead, she chose to stay exactly who she was. The confrontation was drawing attention. Other students were gathering, phones out, ready to record another viral moment. But Sarah stood up, gathering her things. "I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of making this worse," she said to Jason. "This isn't about revenge. It's about change." As she walked away, she could hear Emma and Marcus following her. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Board meeting moved up to tomorrow. Bring your documentation. This is moving faster than expected." Sarah took a deep breath. The real battle was just beginning. Her mother had always taught her that true change wasn't about winning arguments. It was about transforming systems. But system change meant disruption, and disruption meant resistance. The question was, how many others were ready to stand up and be counted? That afternoon, as Sarah walked to her mother's car after school, she noticed something different about Riverside High. Students who had never spoken to her before were nodding and greeting. Teachers who had always looked away were making eye contact, some with shame, others with newfound respect. Dr. Thompson was waiting in her car, working on her laptop. She looked up as Sarah approached. "Ready for tomorrow?" "Meh." Sarah thought about everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. The confrontation, the viral video, the discussions in class, the whispers in hallways, the anger, the support, the fear, and the hope. "What happens next?" Sarah asked as she got into the car. Her mother closed her laptop and started the engine. "Now," she said, "we show them what real institutional change looks like. And believe me, some people aren't going to like it one bit." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood at the Thompson household. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, picking at her breakfast, while her mother reviewed her presentation materials one last time. They'd been up late into the night, preparing for what promised to be a pivotal school board meeting. "Mom," Sarah said, pushing her cereal bowl aside, "what if this makes things worse? What if—" "Baby girl," Dr. Thompson interrupted, using her childhood nickname. "Remember what Maya Angelou said. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. We're not just fighting for you anymore." Sarah's phone buzzed with a group text. Emma had created a support chat with several students, including some surprising names. Bradley Cooper, the student body president, and son of one of the school board members, had just sent a message. "We'll be there, all of us." When they arrived at the school board building, Sarah was stunned by the crowd. Students, parents, and teachers filled the parking lot. Some held signs, "Education is for everyone," and "End systemic racism at Riverside." Local news vans were parked along the street, reporters doing live morning broadcasts. Mr. Rodriguez was organizing a group of teachers near the entrance. "Dr. Thompson, Sarah," he called out, waving them over. "We've got something you need to see." He handed Dr. Thompson a folder. Inside were signed statements from 15 current and former teachers at Riverside, each detailing instances of discrimination they had witnessed or been pressured to participate in. "It's not just Mrs. Blackwood," he explained. "This goes all the way up to Vice Principal Winters." Sarah noticed Mrs. Blackwood's daughter, Rebecca, standing near the building's entrance with a small group of supporters. She was speaking to a reporter, her face flushed with emotion. "My mother has dedicated her life to education. This is nothing but a witch hunt orchestrated by people who don't appreciate traditional academic standards." Inside the boardroom, tension crackled like static electricity. The 9 board members sat behind their elevated desk, facing rows of chairs that were quickly filling up. Sarah recognized Mr. Cooper, Bradley's father, his expression unreadable as he shuffled through papers. Superintendent Davis called the meeting to order, his voice strained. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a formal proceeding. We will maintain order and—" "Point of order," Dr. Thompson stood, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Given the nature of today's discussion, I move that we address the clear conflict of interest present in this room. 3 board members, including yourself, Superintendent Davis, have family members who have been directly implicated in the documentation I've submitted." A murmur went through the crowd. The superintendent's grandson was the head of Riverside's disciplinary committee, which Dr. Thompson's report had identified as showing significant racial bias in its decisions. "Dr. Thompson," one of the other board members, Ms. Reeves, leaned forward. "You yourself have a child in the school. Couldn't that be considered a conflict of interest?" "The difference, Ms. Reeves, is that I'm not sitting in judgment today. I'm presenting evidence that has been independently verified by educational consultants and civil rights attorneys." She placed a thick binder on the presentation podium. "Evidence that shows a pattern of discrimination so pervasive that it can no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in methodical deconstruction. Dr. Thompson presented data showing how students of color were systematically discouraged from taking advanced classes, how disciplinary actions were disproportionately applied, and how certain teachers' grading patterns showed clear bias. But it was the testimonies that truly shifted the atmosphere in the room. Current and former students spoke about their experiences. Parents shared stories of fighting to get their children into AP classes despite having qualifying scores. Teachers described being pressured to maintain what one called the traditional character of Riverside High. Sarah watched her mother work, not just presenting evidence, but weaving a narrative that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one teacher's racist comments. It was about a system that had been designed to maintain certain hierarchies while presenting a facade of fairness. During a brief recess, Sarah overheard 2 board members talking in the hallway. "We can't ignore this," one was saying. "If this goes to the media—" "It's already in the media," the other replied. "The question is, do we want to be remembered as the board that fought change or the one that led it?" Back in the boardroom, Rebecca Blackwood was given time to speak in her mother's defense. She started confidently enough, talking about her mother's years of service and commitment to excellence. But when Dr. Thompson began her cross-examination, things quickly unraveled. "Ms. Blackwood, are you aware that during your mother's tenure, only 8 black students have been recommended for AP English, despite over 50 meeting the qualifying criteria?" That must be because... And are you aware that your mother explicitly stated in a 2019 department meeting that certain literary works were too ethnic for advanced classes? I have the minutes right here. The room had grown so quiet you could hear the rain pattering against the windows. Outside, the crowd had grown larger despite the weather. Students were streaming the proceedings on their phones, sharing real-time updates on social media. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this was no longer just about Mrs. Blackwood's fate. This was about the soul of Riverside High, about what kind of institution it would be going forward. Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Bradley Cooper, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Can we talk?" he whispered. "There's something you and your mom need to know." Sarah followed Bradley to a quiet corner of the hallway, away from the crowd. He kept looking over his shoulder, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "My dad's been on the school board for 12 years, he began, his voice low. "Last night, he was up late making phone calls. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but—" He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Sarah's eyes widened as she heard Mr. Cooper's voice. "Listen, we need to contain this. If they start digging into the redistricting decisions from 2019, everything falls apart. Get the files from the basement archive and—" Bradley stopped the recording. "There's more. My father has a private email server where he keeps all the board's sensitive communications. I know because I helped him set it up for his real estate business, but he's been using it for school board matters too." Sarah's mind raced. "We need to get my mom." But before they could move, Vice Principal Winters appeared at the end of the hallway. His eyes narrowed as he saw them together. "Mr. Cooper," he called out, "your father's looking for you." Bradley straightened up, years of conditioning kicking in. "Yes, sir. I'll be right there." He gave Sarah a meaningful look before walking away. Inside the boardroom, the afternoon session was about to begin. Dr. Thompson was organizing her notes when Sarah slipped her a hastily written message. Her mother's expression didn't change as she read it, but her posture shifted subtly, like a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. As the session resumed, Dr. Thompson adjusted her strategy. "I'd like to call attention to the district's redistricting decisions from 2019, she announced. Several board members suddenly sat up straighter. Specifically, the demographic shifts that occurred following those changes. Mr. Cooper's face had gone slightly pale. "That's not relevant to the current discussion about Mrs. Blackwood's conduct." "On the contrary," Dr. Thompson smiled, "it's central to understanding the institutional context that enabled such conduct. For example, could you explain why the redistricting maps were never made public, despite multiple Freedom of Information Act requests?" Before Mr. Cooper could respond, the door burst open. A young woman Sarah recognized as their local civil rights attorney, Ms. Diana Chen, strode in, carrying a laptop and a thick folder. "I apologize for the interruption," Ms. Chen announced, "but I have here evidence of extensive communications between board members using private email servers to discuss official business, including detailed plans to manipulate school boundaries to maintain what they call demographic balance." The room erupted in chaos. Superintendent Davis banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Among the crowd, phones were buzzing as news alerts broke. Breaking: federal investigation launched into Riverside School District redistricting scandal. Sarah watched as her mother remained perfectly calm amid the storm, like the eye of a hurricane. Dr. Thompson had known all along that Mrs. Blackwood was just the beginning. She'd been building this case for years, gathering evidence, making connections, waiting for the right moment. In the gallery, Sarah noticed Emma frantically typing on her phone. Within minutes, student reporters from the school newspaper were live streaming everything. Rebecca Blackwood had gone ghostly white, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. Mr. Rodriguez made his way to where Sarah sat. "Your mother," he whispered. "She didn't just come after one teacher. She's dismantling the whole system." "The system needed dismantling," Sarah replied, thinking of all the students who had been held back, discouraged, or pushed out over the years. Superintendent Davis called for another recess, but Dr. Thompson stood firm. "No," she declared, her voice cutting through the noise. "No more delays, no more backroom discussions. This ends today, in the light." She began projecting emails onto the large screen at the front of the room. Emails about maintaining community standards. Emails about protecting property values. Emails about certain elements and demographic concerns. Years of carefully coded language that, laid bare, revealed the full scope of the discrimination. Bradley Cooper stood up in the gallery. "I have something to say." His father tried to catch his eye, but Bradley kept his gaze forward. "I've benefited from this system my whole life. I got into AP classes automatically. I never had to prove I belonged. And I watched while others, better students than me, had to fight for every opportunity." Other students began standing up too. Emma, Marcus. Even Jason Blackwood rose slowly, looking conflicted but determined. "Your generation gives me hope," Dr. Thompson said softly to Sarah as they watched the students rise. "They're ready for change in a way many adults aren't." Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, streaming through the boardroom windows. Sarah thought about Mrs. Blackwood, sitting at home, probably watching this unfold on local news. She thought about all the teachers like her, all the administrators who had built careers on maintaining an unjust status quo. But mostly she thought about tomorrow, about what Riverside High could become, about all the students who would never have to prove they belonged. Ms. Chen was conferring with federal investigators who had just arrived. Board members were huddled with their attorneys. And through it all, Dr. Thompson stood at the podium, steady as a lighthouse in a storm, illuminating decades of darkness. "Mom," Sarah said during a brief lull, "what happens now?" Dr. Thompson looked at her daughter, then at the room full of students standing tall, ready for change. "Now," she said, "we rebuild, and we make sure everyone has a seat at the table." The following weeks at Riverside High felt like living through an earthquake's aftershocks. The initial board meeting had triggered a cascade of events that no one could have predicted. Superintendent Davis had resigned, along with 3 board members, including Mr. Cooper. Vice Principal Winters was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Mrs. Blackwood had officially submitted her retirement paperwork. But the empty spaces they left behind created new challenges. "It's not enough to tear down the old system," Dr. Thompson explained to a packed auditorium one evening. The school was hosting its first ever community forum for educational equity. "We have to build something better." Sarah sat in the front row with Emma and Bradley, taking notes. Bradley had faced harsh criticism from some family friends for his role in exposing the corruption, but he'd found unexpected support among his peers. His father hadn't spoken to him in 2 weeks. "I don't regret it," he told Sarah during lunch one day, "but sometimes doing the right thing feels lonely." The interim administration, led by Acting Superintendent Dr. James Chen, no relation to the attorney, had implemented immediate changes. All AP class applications were now reviewed by a diverse committee of teachers and parents. The disciplinary review board was completely restructured, but the deeper work was just beginning. One morning, Sarah arrived at school to find Jason Blackwood waiting by her locker. "I need to talk to you," he said, looking uncomfortable but determined. "About my aunt." Sarah tensed, but nodded for him to continue. "She's been crying a lot," he said. "Not because she lost her job, but she's been reading all these books and articles about systemic racism. She keeps saying she never understood, never wanted to understand. Yesterday she asked if you would be willing to meet with her." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. "Why?" "She wants to apologize, not for the cameras, not for show. She says she needs to take responsibility for the harm she's caused. All these years, all those students." Before Sarah could respond, the morning announcements crackled over the intercom. But instead of the usual administrative voice, it was Marcus Johnson speaking. "Good morning, Riverside High. As your newly elected student body president, I'm excited to announce our first student-faculty coalition for educational justice meeting today after school. Everyone is welcome. As Dr. Thompson always says, change happens when we make room for all voices at the table." Sarah smiled, remembering the heated student council election last week. Marcus had won by a landslide, with support from students across all social and racial groups. His campaign slogan had been simple: Riverside Rising. In AP English, now taught by Ms. Martinez, who had been officially hired to replace Mrs. Blackwood, the class was discussing James Baldwin. The conversations were different now, more honest, more challenging, more real. Students who had never spoken up before were finding their voices. "You know what's weird?" Emma said during their study group. "It feels like we're finally actually learning, not just memorizing stuff for tests, but really engaging with ideas." The local media had started calling it the Riverside Revolution. Other schools in the district were facing their own reckonings as parents and students began questioning long-accepted practices. Dr. Thompson was receiving speaking invitations from across the country, but change never comes without resistance. Some parents had withdrawn their children in protest. Anonymous hate mail arrived regularly at the Thompson house. There were heated arguments at board meetings about lowering standards and reverse discrimination. "They don't get it," Sarah told her mother one evening. Making things fair doesn't mean lowering standards. It means raising them for everyone. Dr. Thompson smiled proudly. You sound like me at your age. The next day, Sarah found a letter in her locker. She recognized Mrs. Blackwood's handwriting on the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Dear Sarah, I've written and rewritten this letter 100 times. Nothing I can say will undo the harm I've caused, not just to you, but to countless students over the years. I used to think I was maintaining standards. Now I understand I was maintaining barriers. Your mother's actions forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. At first, I was angry, then defensive. Finally, I began to listen, really listen. I've enrolled in a cultural competency certification program. I'm working with a racial equity consultant. I know it's too late for me to return to teaching, but perhaps I can help other educators avoid making the same mistakes I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that you and your mother have taught me more than I ever taught in my 30 years at Riverside. Would you be willing to meet with me? I understand if the answer is no. Sincerely, Eleanor Blackwood. Sarah sat with the letter for a long time, watching students pass in the hallway. She saw Marcus organizing a meeting of the student coalition. She saw Bradley helping a freshman navigate the new AP application process. She saw Ms. Martinez and Mr. Rodriguez co-planning an interdisciplinary unit on civil rights movements. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Just got out of the board meeting. Big changes coming. Want to help me plan the next phase? After 3 days of careful consideration, Sarah decided to meet with Mrs. Blackwood. They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between their homes, on neutral ground. Dr. Thompson offered to accompany her daughter, but Sarah knew this was something she needed to do alone. Mrs. Blackwood looked different out of her usual teaching attire. She wore a simple sweater and slacks, her formerly severe bun replaced by a softer style that made her appear more human, more vulnerable. When Sarah walked in, the former teacher's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Blackwood said softly, her voice lacking its former authoritative edge. "I wasn't sure you would." Sarah sat down, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. "I almost didn't," she admitted, "but something my mother always says kept coming back to me. Growth requires discomfort on both sides." Their conversation started awkwardly, but gradually gained momentum. Mrs. Blackwood shared stories from her own upbringing in a segregated southern town, not as excuses but as context for the biases she'd never properly examined. She spoke about her ongoing work with diversity consultants and the painful process of confronting her own prejudices. "I keep a journal now," she explained, pulling out a worn notebook. "Every time I catch myself making an assumption or a judgment based on race, I write it down. Then I force myself to examine where that thought came from and why I held it. It's exhausting." "Being on the receiving end of those assumptions is exhausting too," Sarah replied quietly. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I'm beginning to understand. Yesterday I reread all my old class evaluation forms. I saw patterns I'd been blind to before. The way I'd dismiss certain students' interpretations of literature because they didn't match my traditional understanding. The way I'd grade more harshly when the writing style didn't conform to what I considered proper English. Meanwhile, changes at Riverside High continued to unfold. The Student-Faculty Coalition had successfully lobbied for a new curriculum review process that emphasized diverse perspectives and experiences. Reading lists were being expanded, teaching methods reimagined. One morning, during the coalition meeting, Bradley shared some unexpected news. "My father called last night," he said. "First time since everything happened. He's been doing his own soul-searching, I guess. He asked if he could come to our next meeting, not to speak, just to listen." The coalition members debated this request intensely. Some worried it was a PR stunt. Others argued that real change required engaging with those who had opposed it. Finally, Marcus proposed a solution. "He can come, but first he has to attend our new parent education's workshops on educational equity." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jason Blackwood. "My aunt's been meeting with other retired teachers. They're forming some kind of support group for educators, working to address their biases. They want to know if your mom would consider being an advisor." After school, Sarah found Emma in the library, working on their newly launched peer tutoring program. The initiative had initially faced skepticism from some teachers who doubted students could effectively support each other's learning, but the results were already proving them wrong. "You know what's amazing?" Emma said, looking up from her planning sheets. "We're not just helping with academics. We're building relationships across all these invisible lines that used to divide us." Yesterday, I heard two freshmen from completely different backgrounds bonding over their shared love of astronomy. The local education board had taken notice of Riverside's transformation. They were using it as a model for district-wide reforms. Dr. Thompson had been appointed to head a task force on educational equity, and other schools were sending teachers to observe Riverside's new programs. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Anonymous comments on local news websites still complained about lowering standards and political correctness gone too far. Some parents continued to resist changes to the curriculum, and occasionally old attitudes would surface in subtle ways. During one particularly heated parent meeting, a mother stood up and demanded, "How do we know these changes aren't just making things worse? Where's the proof this is actually helping students?" Dr. Thompson calmly projected a series of graphs onto the screen. "In the 3 months since implementing our new policies, disciplinary incidents have dropped by 40%. Classroom participation has increased across all demographic groups, and most importantly, student surveys show a significant improvement in feelings of belonging and academic confidence." Sarah watched her mother handle these challenges with grace and determination. But late one night, she found Dr. Thompson sitting alone in their kitchen, looking tired. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough," her mother confessed. "If we're moving too slowly. If—" "Mom," Sarah interrupted, "remember what you told me about change? It's not just about speed, it's about sustainability. We're not just changing rules or policies, we're changing hearts and minds." The next day, Sarah had her second meeting with Mrs. Blackwood. This time, they met at Riverside High itself, in Sarah's old AP English classroom. The former teacher stood in the doorway for a long moment before entering. "It looks so different," she murmured, taking in the new posters on the walls. Quotes from authors of diverse backgrounds, student artwork reflecting various cultural perspectives. "It feels different too," Sarah replied. "But you know what? That's not just because of the decorations. It's because we're different, all of us." Mrs. Blackwood nodded slowly, running her hand along her old desk. "I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind. I spent 30 years thinking I was maintaining standards, when really I was maintaining barriers. But maybe it's not too late to be part of building something better." Spring arrived at Riverside High, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed fitting for a school in transformation. The cherry trees in the courtyard bloomed, their pink petals drifting across newly installed benches where student study groups now gathered during lunch. Dr. Thompson's task force had expanded its scope, creating a comprehensive plan for district-wide reform. Sarah often found herself helping her mother sort through emails from educators across the country, all asking about the Riverside model. One afternoon, as Sarah was leaving her AP English class, Ms. Martinez called her back. "I've been thinking about next year," the teacher said. "We're redesigning the curriculum again, and I'd like you to be part of the committee. Your perspective would be valuable." "Me?" Sarah asked, surprised. "You helped start this change," Ms. Martinez smiled. "It's only right that you help guide it." The student newspaper, now co-edited by Emma and Jason Blackwood, a partnership that had raised eyebrows but proved remarkably effective, had just published a special issue titled Voices of Change. It featured interviews with students, teachers, and parents about their experiences during Riverside's transformation. One article particularly caught Sarah's attention, an interview with Bradley Cooper's father. Mr. Cooper had indeed attended the parent education workshops, and his comments reflected a painful but profound journey. "I've spent my life believing I was protecting standards of excellence," he was quoted saying. "It took my own son to show me that what I was really protecting was privilege. The hardest part isn't admitting you were wrong. It's accepting that you hurt people while believing you were right." The article included statistics about the changes at Riverside. AP class enrollment now reflected the school's actual demographics. Disciplinary referrals had continued to decline, and student satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. But more telling were the personal stories. Students who had finally found their voice, teachers who had transformed their methods, parents who had confronted their own biases. During a coalition meeting, Marcus shared news about the upcoming school board elections. 3 of the candidates are Riverside parents who've been part of our changes here. And get this, one of them is Bradley's dad. "My father says he wants to help other schools do what we've done here," Bradley added. "He says he owes it to all the students he failed before." The meeting was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Blackwood. She stood nervously in the doorway until Sarah waved her in. The former teacher had become a regular speaker at educational conferences, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and a testament to the possibility of change. "I've been working with a group of retired teachers," she announced. "We've developed a program to help educators recognize and address unconscious bias in their teaching. We're calling it Teaching for Transformation, and we'd like your input before we launch it." Later that week, Sarah found herself in an unusual position, sitting on a panel with her mother, Mrs. Blackwood, and other education leaders at a statewide conference on educational equity. As she looked out at the audience of educators, administrators, and policymakers, she felt the weight of their journey. "The easy part," she told the audience, "is changing rules and policies. The hard part is changing hearts and minds. But the hardest part? That's keeping the change going when the spotlight fades and the real work begins." The conference room was silent as she continued. "Everyone wants a quick fix, a simple solution. But real change is messy. It's uncomfortable. It means having hard conversations and making space for growth, even from people who have hurt you. It means understanding that transformation is a process, not an event." After the conference, Mrs. Blackwood approached Sarah. "I've been offered a position at the State Department of Education," she said. "They want me to help develop anti-bias training programs for teachers. I wanted to ask, would you be willing to be a consultant on the project? Your perspective would be invaluable." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Working with Mrs. Blackwood would have seemed unthinkable just months ago, but then she remembered something her mother always said. "The measure of change isn't in how far you've come, but in how far you're willing to go." That evening at home, Sarah found her mother in the study, surrounded by papers and laptop screens. "Mom," she said, "remember when you told me that change happens when we make room for all voices at the table?" Dr. Thompson looked up, nodding. "I think it's time we set a bigger table." 1 year after the incident that started it all, Riverside High held a special ceremony to unveil its new mission statement. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, parents, and community members. Local news cameras rolled as Sarah took the stage alongside her mother. The new mission statement, crafted through months of community input, read, "Riverside High School is committed to fostering academic excellence through equity, inclusion, and the celebration of diverse perspectives. We believe that every student deserves not just access to education, but the support, respect, and opportunity to thrive." As Sarah looked out at the audience, she saw faces that told the story of their journey. Mrs. Blackwood sat in the middle row, her posture relaxed but dignified, so different from the rigid authority figure she'd once been. Her statewide teacher training program was already showing promising results in other districts. Bradley Cooper and his father sat together, their relationship renewed through shared purpose. Mr. Cooper had won the school board election and was working to implement Riverside's reforms across the district. His real estate company had even established a scholarship fund for underserved students. Emma and Jason's joint leadership of the school newspaper had earned them national recognition for their coverage of educational equity issues. Their latest edition featured a cover story about Riverside's influence on schools across the state. Marcus Johnson, now in his final month as student body president, had established a mentorship program pairing upperclassmen with incoming freshmen, ensuring that the culture of inclusion would continue after his graduation. Dr. Thompson stepped up to the podium. "A year ago," she began, "we faced a moment of crisis that could have torn our community apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways we never expected. We learned that true education isn't just about what we teach. It's about how we treat each other, how we handle our mistakes, and how we grow from them." She continued, "But our work isn't finished. It will never be finished. Each new school year brings new challenges, new students, new opportunities to either reinforce old barriers or break them down. The choice will always be ours." Sarah watched as her mother invited Mrs. Blackwood to join them on stage, a moment that symbolized both how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The former teacher's hands shook slightly as she took the microphone. "When I first started teaching," Mrs. Blackwood said, "I thought I knew what excellence looked like. It took losing everything I thought I knew to understand that true excellence comes not from maintaining barriers, but from breaking them down. Not from excluding voices, but from amplifying them." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in her old AP English classroom. The space had been transformed, not just physically with its diverse reading lists and student artwork, but energetically. It felt alive with possibility. Ms. Martinez was preparing for the next day's class. "You know," she said, seeing Sarah in the doorway, "your mother's action started something important, but it was your courage that showed us all how to face our biases with honesty and grace." Sarah touched the desk where she'd once sat, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "I just did what felt right," she said. "That's usually how change begins," Ms. Martinez smiled. That evening at home, Sarah and her mother sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. "Mom," Sarah said, "do you think we really change things? I mean, permanently?" Dr. Thompson was quiet for a moment. "Change isn't permanent unless we make it so," she finally replied. "What we did was open a door. What happens next depends on everyone who walks through it." She handed Sarah a letter, an acceptance to Columbia University's Teachers College. "Your essay about this year impressed them," she smiled. "They want you to be part of their new educational equity and leadership program." Sarah held the letter, thinking about the circle of change. A black student facing discrimination, a mother fighting for justice, a teacher learning to confront her biases, a community learning to grow, and now a new generation preparing to carry the work forward. "You know what I learned from all this?" Sarah said, watching the sky turn purple and gold. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage, and sometimes the hardest person to change is yourself." Her mother squeezed her hand. "That's why we keep working," she said. "That's why we keep hoping. That's why we keep teaching." As night fell over their neighborhood, Sarah thought about all the students who would pass through Riverside's halls in the years to come. They would never know the full story of what happened there, but they would feel its effects in every class, every conversation, every opportunity to learn and grow. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that true change isn't about erasing the past, but about using it to build a better future. One classroom, one conversation, one moment of courage at a time. Because in the end, the story of Riverside High wasn't just about confronting racism or transforming a school. It was about the power of truth to open hearts, the strength of courage to change minds, and the endless possibility of growth when we dare to face our own prejudices and choose a different path. It was about learning that education at its best isn't just about what we know, but about who we become. And for Sarah Thompson, it was just the beginning.